Hi, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining me. And today I have on my weekly chat Dr. Shankara Shetty. And I love talking to him because he brings such insight into COVID, thinking around medicine. And I still am shocked. I'm still surprised at the fact that he is fighting to protect his career because some people are upset about some of the things he says and critically what he did in terms of the saving of lives in the pandemic. I still maintain that at the end of the day, if we don't embrace physicians who are creative, who are willing to make a difference, especially in an environment where you have a pandemic and limited options. To find somebody who is able to intervene for their patients is a tremendous gift. So we're continuing to talk about the probing of the science, and today we're talking about misinformation. I'll just quickly bring Shankara in. Hi, Shankara, how are you? You're muted at the moment, so you just make yeah, just unmute yourself. Yeah, there
There we
you
go.
go.
Hi, Philip. Yeah, welcome to all the audience tonight.
Yes, excellent. So yeah, so today we're talking about misinformation, and I'll show you the thumbnail here. Is that even possible from our health agencies and governments? And we're starting off, Shankar, because I'll be asking you some of the harder questions about what got you into trouble. And why are they so upset with you in South Africa about some of the things that you had said? And they label that as misinformation. And I want to show you, I'll show the audience what they're talking about, but we are also going to be talking about what happened around the recent FDA change of heart with some posts that they did on ivermectin, and as well looking at the recent paper on reduced risk of thromboembolic events after vaccination, as we think about what really is misinformation versus disinformation. I think the difference is that misinformation you don't know and you speak about it and it can cause harm. That's mis. Disinformation is where you do know better and you deliberately share information that can cause harm. And this is one of the big challenges that we have. So let's look at this first, your case, and then we'll jump into some of the other stuff. So Shankara, this is part of what is being brought against you. I'm just going to quickly bring it back. It's a Dr. Sena. Who exactly is that?
Yeah, that's an expert witness for the prosecution.
Okay. And so they have been brought in with the view of challenging, saying that in effect, what you had said was misinformation. And so I'll slide down, and it highlights you. And it's highlighting just a summary of the case, and they're talking about some of the points that were made. He's acting on behalf of Professor Venter.
Yes, Philip.
Yeah.
That is the chief complainant, the person who brought the charges against me, is the head of a medical institution here in South Africa.
Okay.
Unfortunately, like most in the pandemic, conflicted in interest.
Conflicted interests. Yes, yes. All right. Let me just get you in the right place here. Yeah. So, okay. I just want to ask you a few questions about their allegations and what it is. So, I think the main issue is that they have highlighted that you were at a conference, and in the main complainant, it featured Dr. Chetty at this conference, and then you go on to make unprecedented claims in the video. Was this a private public conference? What was it?
It was a private conference, Philip. I had done an interview that caused a stir in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, and so I was approached to set up a summit. I got in touch with other doctors that I knew and people that had understanding, and we set up this summit. And I was meant to close out the summit on the third day with a few doctors summarizing all that was spoken about at that summit. And it was a pretty controversial summit, seeing that we brought everything to the table. People realize that there's an agenda and there's things that are not being said. So we had people from around the world for 3 days presenting the information that people were not hearing. And so the
Mm.
summit in itself was an eye opening summit. And as a summary at the end of it, we were talking about the illogic behind the public health interventions, the lockdowns, the masking, the social distancing, and why that doesn't actually work. And so I just made a comment that if you don't understand the agenda, then it'll look nonsensical. But if you understand that there's a bigger agenda at play and these measures where they're not solely for public health intervention, then you'd understand why they were doing what they were doing. And someone asked me, so what's the intention? And
Yeah.
my conscience got the better of me, and I felt that
And
with the
I will get
information
you
I
not to say it.
had. Yeah, and
Whatever.
so I thought
So,
I need to put this into perspective.
yeah,
You know,
so the question is that, so we talk all the time, and just for the audience to understand, is that when we speak off the air, people will say things that they wouldn't say on the air. Did you perceive that situation almost like one of those private conversations that you would have? So if you were going back in time and this was, you perceived it like as a public forum. No, it was public, but did in your mind you perceive it as that?
no, Philip, I perceived it as a private forum. Uh, Look, at that time, the journey that I'd taken, the things that had happened, drew my attention to something being amiss. And this was a private setting. I knew that my perspective needed a little bit further to be clarified, but there were a lot of things pointing to it being correct. And in this forum, I knew that humanity wasn't ready for the truth. I knew that it would be a miss of me to bring this out into a public setting. And I thought, well, look, Philip, there were almost 1,000 people on that Zoom, ranging from ministers, public health officials, who all wanted to hear what was going on because of the concern around spike protein and this vaccine that was going to have spike protein in it. And that is the context. I thought if I say it to these people, they can take it and investigate it further, and we can avert catastrophe.
Hmm. So in that presentation, you then, as you said, spoke about toxicity. You spoke about deliberate. Man, those are some heavy words.
Yeah.
And so this is what they are taking to say that, so I'm trying to understand this, you were talking in a conference that people had to register to come to. You were asked your opinion on it. You shared some personal views on it. Some people may disagree with it. Is that enough to take away someone's license? When I think about what has happened even in the UK, when they had a big donor to the government saying some things about women and women of color, they didn't insist on him giving back the money. It was in a he said it was taken out of context, but he did say it. And so sometimes I'm wondering, I'm really genuinely trying to understand, even if this was very public and people disagree with it. I think their concern is that you're damaging the integrity of the profession. Is that unreasonable?
I think it is, Philip. I made it very clear during the video several times that this is my opinion. It is not a fact, and I clarified it. The reason I spoke on it being deliberate was a culmination of many events that drew my attention to what was actually going on. Just to put perspective, Philip, to where I was at that conference in my thinking, I had by now figured out that the biphasic nature of the illness and the dangerous second phase was being triggered by spike protein. So I was talking out against spike protein already in late 2020 as being the primary pathogen. I understood that the mechanisms behind the manufacture of this vaccine and how it was meant to trigger the immune response. And you're triggering the immune response with an allergen rather than something that will give you immunity to a virus. And exposing people to that pathogen seemed to be nonsensical from the
Mm.
perspective of biotechnology and the development of a vaccine. And so I started speaking out against that, hoping that someone would say, hey, okay, we made a mistake. Let's use a different platform to manufacture a vaccine. It wasn't against the vaccine, it was against the mechanism of how this vaccine was supposed to give benefit. And then I spoke to people from different organizations, and I got an idea of what the agenda was, that this wasn't about public health. It seemed to be more a nefarious agenda. Now, keeping that at the back of my mind, uh, I was told that the vaccine rollout was going to be mandated, which wasn't actually the issue at the time. When this conversation came up, it was being rolled out to old age homes and essential workers only, and everyone was clamoring, waiting for the public to be able to get the vaccine itself. So,
Mm, yeah,
what
and it
what
right
actually
here,
transpired?
you're quite right.
Yeah,
He said that.
yeah,
He
yeah.
talks of it being mandated. The recording occurs before they began. So
Yes,
you were accurate in your prediction.
that it would be mandated. You see, Philip, what I was looking at, I knew I had a toxic vaccine that was going to cause harm to people. Now, for me to understand the intent behind it, when someone wants to put this out, I got to understand what's the plan. What are you trying to achieve? Now, looking at that, something toxic, if I understand the toxicity of something, but it's here on my desk, it's not going to harm anyone, though I understand the toxicity of giving it to someone. If someone, by their own free will, took it, then they've made a bad choice, an ill informed choice, but it was of their own free will that they took it. And then you can consider whether they were informed sufficiently to make that decision. But the day I force someone to take that substance, knowing full well that it is toxic, it becomes a criminal act and it's called a poisoning. So it's
So,
the
so
intent behind it. So as soon as I saw mandates, it became a criminal act in my mind.
okay, no. So let's just think about something a minute, because the main issue for many people who are quite angry at people who spoke out is that their view is that as professionals, we have to be consistent in our positioning, especially around public health issues. But the question is, suppose there is a genuine concern. Now, someone may argue that they don't think your concern at the time was genuine. Are you are you free to speak about it if you genuinely are concerned? Where does the whistleblower kind of question fit into that? Because based on what they're saying is that they're saying you shouldn't or couldn't speak out about a concern.
I think that's misinformed, Philip. Uh, we should have public discourse without the need for censorship. Remember that when you talk of public discourse, there are sufficient rules and regulations in place as to what can be broadcast. So we have relevant regulation preventing nudity, pornography, hate speech, content that might offend viewers. So we have those rules and regulations in place. There's no reason to censor it. So people need to understand that you have the right to listen to everyone's opinion. And if there is a need for censorship, then it speaks to the uh, people that are censoring and their respect for society's ability to be discreet and discretionary when they look at evidence. So someone shouldn't be telling you they'll decide what you need to hear and don't need to hear. If you think I'm a quack spreading misinformation, so be it. You're not obliged to listen to me. And you're obliged to comment, and I'll be willing to respond appropriately. But censorship, it just takes the idea off the table. And it might be an idea that leads to some fruitful conclusion.
Yeah. So I think that for the audience to know, we keep on talking about this because Dr. Chetty is standing up to these accusations. He is planning to challenge them. And we are going to wish him the best of luck with that. And I think it is right to bring the challenge to the authorities. Now, it doesn't mean they'll agree with him, but certainly he has a right to raise his own perspectives, which I think is quite admirable. So as we shift on, Shankar, and we look at some other areas that I find are interesting, I'm going to highlight to you this recent ruling and just get some thoughts on it from you. And so this is about, this is a article from the LA Times, and they are upset that the FDA settled the lawsuit over ivermectin warnings. Now, just in case you are not aware, it's really about this here where FDA said you're not a horse, stop it with ivermectin. It's not authorized for treating COVID. And the doctors took them to court to challenge whether or not the FDA was able to do it. And then the FDA agreed, back down, will seek to make recommendations against the misuse of products in the future. And having that decision on the books, it will be used to litigate against it. So they took the position that they were not in a position to give directions to medical people about what should and shouldn't be used. But the argument from this is that they shouldn't have backed down because they're giving the impression that ivermectin actually works. And they're saying here there is no evidence that ivermectin works. Any thoughts on all of this?
I think it makes you wonder, Philip, who was spreading the disinformation around ivermectin. Ivermectin is a safe drug. It's been used for many generations. So if it didn't work, there was no reason to actually restrict its use because it has an excellent safety profile. It would just do nothing. It won't be effective, but it won't cause harm. The bottom line is do no harm. So, excuse me, I don't see the reason to have had that kind of attitude towards it in the first place. And the fact that they have to backtrack against it, the news outlet shouldn't be annoyed that they backtracking. The news outlet should be annoyed that their source proved to be a source of disinformation and rather look for better informed sources in future rather than to direct your source on how to misinform the public in future.
No, I think part of the problem is you have to take yourself back to that time. So, in reality, the primary piece of misinformation that existed was that the COVID vaccine stopped infection. Okay, so you just have to think about that a minute. Now, I think that the pharmaceutical companies knew that they were studying severity of disease, not infection, but it was an additional benefit that it seemed to reduce the risk of infection in the first few months. But then this got picked up by governments and regulatory agencies to say that, okay, if it therefore needs to be as widely accepted across the public as it can. And anything that questioned that rollout was not in the interest of the public. And so this is where now, with people who were already hesitant, they were then saying, okay, we will instead use something like ivermectin. And what the public health people were saying, no, 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 you are now not taking the vaccine. And that is a risk to the whole population. That's where the argument came from. Any thoughts on that?
I think that comes down to Philip selling individual and group benefit to the public. The prevention of severe illness and death is an individual benefit. It doesn't pose a benefit as a group taking the vaccine. So whoever takes the vaccine will not get severely ill or die, but taking the vaccine doesn't impact on the person next to them. Preventing infection and transmission impacts on the person next to them and gives the population a group-based benefit. Therapeutics are an individual benefit. So both the prevention of severe illness and death by the vaccine or ivermectin is just an individual benefit. But they were selling the vaccine not just as a therapeutic, but as a prophylactic to give it to even people that are not sick. So it's got dual use. It's used, they're saying it's treatment and they're saying it's a prophylactic, whereas treatments like ivermectin are treatments. You give it to sick people only. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, there was an agenda there to try and suppress treatment. And remember, any acknowledgement of treatment interventions that were successful would negate the need for an emergency use authorization for a vaccine. The
Yeah.
emergency authorization was based on the fact that there was no other intervention that was possible. So there's legal issues around it. There's other agendas around it, not to acknowledge that there are alternate treatments. So again,
No.
Philip, misinformation, disinformation, omission, and commission all create problems.
Yeah. So in the paper here, this was the meta-analysis. They said no significant difference in all-cause mortality rates or PCR negative conversion between ivermectin and controls. So this is what they're saying is that it doesn't work. That's the argument. But what they go on immediately to say, and this is really the standout, there were significant differences in mechanical ventilation requirement and adverse events between the two groups. Ivermectin could reduce the risk of mechanical ventilation requirement and adverse effect. It's like they're saying the opposite thing in the same sentence. The
Sentence. Yeah.
whole purpose of everything that we did was to reduce the pressure on hospitals and intensive care. So, if you have something that actually could reduce the risk of mechanical ventilation, I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. You
Yeah.
know, if it's relatively innocuous,
Now,
why
Philip,
would
if
you not
you
use it in
yeah,
conjunction? You know,
you should you can look at that in context, Philip. If you say that ivermectin reduced the risk of mechanical ventilation and adverse events, remember, a majority of the mortality in COVID illness came from mechanical ventilation and adverse events to the virus, not the virus itself. So you taking out that means what they basically saying is that ivermectin was significant in its ability to improve outcomes in two of the most detrimental parts of the illness: adverse events and ventilation that led to the demise of a majority of patients. So you're cherry picking what you put on the table to show people from the study. But we've got to step back and look at the entirety. And Philip, I think these kind of studies really don't speak to medical advancement because it doesn't take the individual patient's response to a medication into consideration. We as clinicians know that different patients react differently. And averaging it over the entirety of patients really doesn't make sense. It doesn't take the nuances of each case into consideration. And that's not the way doctors should be treating patients in the first place.
yeah.
That's how a cook. That's how a cook cooks a meal.
So, moving on again, and we're just touching on a few topics here. So, in our limited time of chatting, here is another one that I thought I'd get your thoughts on. So, this was recent. I had covered this, the role of COVID-19 vaccines in preventing post COVID-19 thromboembolic events and cardiovascular complications. And what they were saying is that if someone was vaccinated, they had a lower risk of a thromboembolic event after they were infected. So this is looking at infection in the delta wave period of time. I'm going to show you something important with that. Now, the problem I had with the paper is that it didn't seem to fit the real world experience. Any thoughts for before I say anything else? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, Philip, it goes contrary to what we're seeing as clinicians. We've seen that the vaccines seem to be increasing thromboembolic complications. Yes, with the claim that vaccination reduce severity of illness. I did mention that I'm suspicious that is due to desensitization or a little bit of tolerance to spike protein, which will make the subsequent reaction to spike protein a little less aggressive and might translate into fewer thromboembolic complications with the vaccine. But if you look at the vaccine, excluding COVID illness, the vaccines have shown far higher thromboembolic complications in the population compared to the unvaccinated, irrespective of COVID illness.
So, just so people understand, the paper is highlighting that the line here is the zero line. Anything this way is in favor, benefit. And you can see across the board from 0 to 30, 31 to 90, 91 to 180, all the way up, there seems to be benefit for all of these conditions. And I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't necessarily make clinical sense. But you're thinking to yourself, well, you do have to trust the research. Now, I'm going to show you something after this. But uh, when people look at that, they would go, yeah, this is clearly beneficial. Why wouldn't people not want to take it? And clearly, anybody who is suggesting otherwise is a problem. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that would be reasonable, Philip, but I think it's also how the numbers were crunched to come to the conclusion. So the question that needs to be asked, yes, you say it's beneficial. The question that needs to be asked is why? Why are we getting that benefit? Not just that we're getting the benefit and let's give it to everyone. If you don't understand why it's there, you might miss what confounds that benefit.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. And so I'm trying to see if I can get this image right. Let me just show you now. So this is from the same paper and the supplementary report. I'll make this big screen here. And the supplementary report broke it down into a number of cohorts. This is cohort one, the older age group. You have then cohort two, which is, I think, high comorbidities. Cohort three, which is younger people. And then it has all the time frames, 91 to 180 days and so on, from the vaccination. Now, say, for instance, in cohort one, and this is what I think it was Dark. I've forgotten who it was that highlighted this, and it was such an important spot. He went through the supplementary report. This is why I'm saying I'm so glad that the listeners do some of this research as well. And say, for instance, in 0 to 30 days, so VTE is a clot in the leg, DVT, well, whole venous thromboembolism, clot in the leg, clot in the lungs. This is mini stroke, heart attack, heart failure. Now, when you look at the numbers, you have here unvaccinated, vaccinated for each of the cohorts. I think this is the UK, this is Estonia, this is Spain. I can't remember where gold is covering. So it was over 10 million patients. So big numbers involved here. But if you pick any one of these here, so say for instance, in the unvaccinated cohort, 346,000, they had less than 5 events compared to 18 in the vaccinated cohort, so 0.33 versus almost zero. And that straight away is not suggestive that this is less. If you look at MI, heart attack, same thing. This is more than double. If you look at heart failure, this is almost 4 times, I mean, 3 times higher. And suddenly, where it seems to be a problem is in this section here. In this one, for some reason, it goes the opposite direction to the Aruam, the gold, and the Spain data. In all of these ones here, there seems to be a higher risk in the vaccinated cohort. And I'm thinking to myself, so is this just about how numbers are crunched? Is this an example of misinformation? Because you're quite right. If you crunch the numbers the wrong way, you will get very strange results. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Philip, I think that's what's been used to misinform the way the data is interpreted. Let's not forget when we talk of a 95% risk reduction when you talk of the Pfizer vaccine, you're talking of a relative risk reduction. But the gold standard is to look at absolute risk reductions. And that is what we're supposed to be coaching to the public to give them an idea of efficacy. Now, if you convert a 95% relative reduction into an absolute risk reduction, then from the start, the vaccine was less than 1% effective. But you couldn't tell the public it's less than 1% effective, they wouldn't buy it. So you crunch the numbers and give them the relative risk reduction without saying it's a relative risk reduction and clarifying what you're actually telling the public. You're telling the public it's 95% effective, but that's a relative risk reduction. It speaks in no way to the true effectiveness of the vaccine itself. So you got to vaccinate hundreds of thousands of people to save a few lives. But then when you do that, you got to then consider what are the risks of doing that. There's no point vaccinating 100,000 people to save one life when the side effects of the vaccine are going to harm more than that one life that you're going to save. And so when
Yeah,
you look
so
at public health measures, you got to look at that broad picture, the risk
yeah, this is
versus the
the
benefit.
issue about all cause mortality, which I've always called for. No, I
Yes.
mean these are tough conversations, Shankara, and as usual for people, because we have these frank discussions. Sometimes not everything can be seen on normal social media. So please make sure if you want to see this live, if you haven't seen the full thing, make sure to take a look at it on Substack. But the point being, Shankara, are we having more damage to the reputation of medicine by the silence of the scientific community across the globe?
I think, Philip, the damage to the medical fraternity is coming from the silencing of discourse between the different sides of the medical community. So, what's happening is invariably People are, like I said, people are not ignorant. You say it once and they'll remember it. So it's and they can be very critical of all the data or the information put in front of them. But what's happening is, because of the censorship, you're getting one side of the narrative being propagated without any challenge to it. So it's not the silence of the scientific community that's bringing this mistrust. It's that people are only hearing one side of the debate and realize that there are two sides of this debate. So it makes it look like the broader scientific community is not looking at the science. But the broader scientific community are looking at the science, they're just being censored and the public is not in view. There are people out there that are in opposition to what actually is going on.
Yeah. So
I
yes,
think how
thank.
it's perceived, Philip.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you as usual, Shankar. We're trying to limit our discussions to about half an hour. I think, as usual, insightful. And as I mentioned before, it's going to be fascinating to see the outcomes of this challenge because it's going to be representative of the future of medicine. Because if there is silencing of debate, if there is silencing of challenge, then it means that there is no science. That's the reality. Without the ability to challenge science, there is no science, whatever one
Yeah,
may think.
I think
So, mm,
yeah, I think Philip, opinion should be allowed. It allows people a broad frame to look at what's in front of them and make informed choices. Uh, a bullet lodged in my brain, Philip, will solve my persistent headache, but that doesn't make a gun a medical intervention, no matter how well you dress it up. So yeah, I think I think people know what's going on around it.
oh, goodness. All right. Thank you very much again, Shankara. You just hung fire with me. Thank you, people, for staying with us. Have a great evening until our next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip.